Morning. I'd like to thank the few and the proud for joining us this morning. So, chapter 27, verse 4. Chapter 27, verse 4. We left off with two questions yesterday. Was what's so important about Esav getting food for Yitzchak before he gives him the bracha? And secondly, if Rivka had reservations about the plan, why didn't she just tell her husband about it? Why did she need this whole plot? Ramban on Pasuk Dalet. Ba'avur tevarechecha nafshi. Hayabadato levarich oso, sheyizkahu bebirkas Avraham, linchol es haaretz. Yitzchak's plan was to bless Esav, that he should bear the blessings upon Avraham, that Avraham's offspring would inherit the land. That should be fulfilled through Esav. Filios hu bal bris lelokim kihu habachor. And he wanted him to be the person who held the covenant because he was the firstborn. V'nira shelo higidalo Rivka me'olam hanavua asher amar Hashem la v'rav yavod so'ira. It's a very interesting Ramban. I think we might have even quoted it earlier in the week. I don't remember. It would seem that Rivka had never shared with Yitzchak the prophecy that she received at the beginning of this week's parsha, that the older one should serve the younger one. If you knew that the older one was supposed to serve the younger one, why in the world would you give the older one a bracha that he has all this prominence? Ki Yitzchak, excuse me, over es pi Hashem v'hilo sitzlach. Why in the world would Yitzchak give a bracha that he thinks is going against the words of the prophecy? It really wasn't, because he wasn't giving the bracha to Esav, he was giving the bracha to the younger son. V'nei mitchila lo higita lo derech musar utznius. So why didn't she tell him all those years ago? So he says, she didn't consult with Yitzchak about going to a prophet to know what was going on with davening. She didn't consult with Yitzchak about that. So it's a little awkward when you come back afterwards. You're like, well, so I had this problem and here's how I dealt with it and here was the solution. Because Yitzchak might have said, why'd you need to do that for? Or why'd you talk to me? Or so on and so forth. So at the beginning, she just didn't think it was so appropriate to share with him, because it was maybe slightly offensive that she went where she went. There's another possibility. So she went to, let's say she went to Shem to get a sense of what God's perspective is here. So she says to herself, my husband is at least as prominent a prophet as the person who I went to. So I'm going to assume that if there's something that Shem knows, Yitzchak probably knows it too. You know what I mean? It's like every now and then I have a very well-meaning person who comes to tell me, they want me to know that there's a certain thing going on in the shul, like a certain program is going on in the shul. And I've been involved in conversations for hours about that program. Yes, I'm aware that program is going on in the shul. I actually knew about it before but it's very sweet of them. But that's what Rivka is saying. I'm going to tell Yitzchak about a nevuah that I became aware of. I'm sure he knows about it. So either because she thought it would be offensive to tell him that she went to Shem, or she just assumed it was a given. He must know about it already. She never shared it with him. So now the obvious question is, fine, I get why she didn't share it at the beginning. But now this makes a big difference. This is obviously important to her. Let her walk into his room and say, this is the prophecy I got years ago. Sorry for never sharing it with you, but this seems like a big deal now. But she was worried that at this juncture, Yitzchak would say, okay, if that's the case, I just won't give any brachos one way or the other. The idea of giving a bracha to the younger son and not giving it to his beloved son Esav, she was worried Yitzchak couldn't process that one. And she wanted her son Yaakov to get this wholehearted bracha from Yitzchak. And so the only way that was going to happen, it actually wouldn't have been enough for her to tell him about the prophecy in order to have him give a wholehearted bracha to Yaakov. The only way to get him to give a wholehearted bracha to Yaakov is if he thinks he's giving it to Esav. Oim sibos meis Hashem kadesh yisbarach Yaakov v'gam Esav b'birkas acherev v'lo levado niskanu ad lilos. Then the next answer the Ramban gives is just so interesting to think about. Basically, the Ramban shrugs his shoulders, and the Ramban says this must be part of God's plan. In the end of the day, they both ended up getting brachos because of these circumstances. Yaakov, of course, got the bracha that Yitzchak thought he was giving to Esav, but then Esav comes back and he's so upset, so he gets his own bracha. And maybe that's really what should have been the whole time. But maybe that's not what Yitzchak would have done if he knew about the prophecy. It's just really interesting things to think about here. Let's go over to the Sforno on Pasuk Dalet. Vaseli matamim. Ratza b'matamim k'dei asik b'chvod av. Remember, we asked, he's going to give this holy bracha. He thinks he's going to give it to Esav. But before he gives the holy bracha, Esav has to go and hunt and make a good supper for him. What's this about? So he wants Esav to be involved in the mitzvah of honoring his father. Ubazeh tachol alav bracha. And through that mitzvah of honoring his father, the bracha will take hold on Esav. Ki gam shlo hikir begodo rishon shel Esav, mikol makom lo chashav oso l'ro'oi, shetachol alav osa bracha, shaya belibo levorcho. This is really, really interesting to think about. There's a lot of discussion in later commentators about these things. But the Sforno says, the bottom line is, Yitzchak didn't understand the magnitude of Esav's wickedness, but Yitzchak didn't think he was such a tzaddik. So Yitzchak actually felt for this bracha to take hold on him, he needed a unique merit of the moment for this bracha to take hold of him. And that's why it doesn't, Esav, go do a mitzvah. Go do a mitzvah, and then you come back from the mitzvah. And then I'll give you this bracha. It's very bad. By the way, it's very interesting to think about. This was a mitzvah that Esav clearly excelled at. There's something to be said that that's the mitzvah Yitzchak. And Yitzchak saw the goodness in Esav in this way. V'lachein k'shebirech Yaakov achar kach sheyada bo shu roi lebracha lo shoal mat'amim lo bikesh davar u'bircho techef ka'amro v'kel shakai v'reichoscha. At the very end of the parsha, Yitzchak gives Yaakov a bracha when he's parting ways, when he's going to Lavan. Now, does Yitzchak say to Yaakov, you need to do a mitzvah? Get me food for supper? Go learn a Blat Gemara and then come back to me? Does he say that to him? He doesn't say that to him. So if this is how brachos are supposed to work, why doesn't he tell him to do a mitzvah? The answer is because he knew Yaakov was fitting to get a bracha. Esav needed to sort of build up his merits a little bit. So it's an interesting sforno to think about. Of course, this sforno sort of has implications in terms of understanding Yitzchak's perception of his sons. Just we could spend a long time talking about that, but we won't. Rivka contacts Yaakov immediately. Let's go to verse 6. Rivka, by the way, it's explicit in the pasuk. I'd forgotten this earlier in the week. It's explicit in the pasuk that Rivka hears this conversation between Yitzchak and Esav. That he's sent on this thing, he's going to come back and get a bracha. And now in verse 6, Rivka Ra Yaakov ben Lemor, Rivka said to Yaakov her son, behold, I've heard your father speaking to Esav, and he said to him, bring me game, make for me tasty food, and I'll eat it. And I will bless you before God, before my death. That's what Yitzchak is saying to your brother Esav. So now, my son, here's what you got to do. You got to get in there and make him think you're Esav and get that bracha. Fascinating Ramban and Pasuk Zayin. So Rivka is quoting Yitzchak. I'll bless what Yitzchak is saying to Esav. I'll bless you before God, before my death. Lo niskar b'chol haparsha lifnei Hashem rak b'makom hazeh. Says the Ramban, if you look at all of these discussions in this section about the bracha, nobody ever says, I'm going to give you a bracha or getting a bracha, whatever it is, before Hashem, except for this one pasuk. So Rivka is quoting Yitzchak, and she says that Yitzchak says, I'm going to give you a bracha before Hashem. doesn't say that when Yitzchak speaks to Esav in the Torah, and in the later Pesukim, it doesn't use that language of before Hashem. So why does Rivka say Lifnei Hashem if it's not recorded elsewhere? Ki Amr Lo Imo Habracha Lifnei Hashem Tiyah. Rivka is explaining to Yaakov why this is such a big deal, because she's sort of putting in an editorial note here. Understand, when your father is talking to Esav about a bracha, it's not like he's wishing him well. It's a bracha Lifnei Hashem, meaning Beruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration. If your brother Esav receives this bracha, Tiskayim bo bizarro la'olam, it's going to stick through the generations in his family. You're not going to be able to stand before him. So this is a big deal. And so the Ramban says that Rivka is explaining to Yaakov why he has to do what she's about to tell him to do, because this is like a divinely powered bracha, and it cannot go to Esav. Really interesting to think about. Move on to verse 12. Actually, let's start with verse 11. Vayomer Yaakov el Rivka imo. Yaakov says to Rivka, his mother, Hein Esav achi ish sair. Esav, my brother, is hairy. V'anochi ish chalak, and my skin is smooth. Verse 12. Ulai musheni avi v'yisi ve'inav kimsateya. What happens if my father touches me, and all of a sudden it's obvious I'm not Esav, and I'm going to be in his eyes like a trickster? That's not going to be a way to get blessed by my father. He's going to curse me. So what's going to happen? Okay, Ramban on Pasuk Yud Beis. Ulai Musheni Avi. So what is this? This is like, instead of asking for a photo ID, Yitzchak's going to say, hold on a second, put out your arms. Let me feel your arms. What's going on? Says the Ramban, Einatam Sheyimusheyu Lahakira. So it's not that he's going to like ascertain his identity by feeling his arms. Avol Omar Ula Yikra Vosi El Atzmo Lenashekli. Olasim Yado Alpana. It's going to be a meaningful moment. Maybe he'll draw me in to give me a kiss. Maybe he'll place his hand on my face. Just as a demonstration of physical affection. And just, along the way, all of a sudden, this doesn't feel like Esav. So that's just an interesting Ramban to keep in mind that was Yaakov's concern. Now the Ramban asks a really obvious question, which I'm sure has occurred to some, if not all of you. What a bizarre thing. What happens if my father happens to touch my skin and realizes I'm not hairy? How about what happens when my father hears me speak? We don't sound the same. Isn't that a much greater concern than how my arms will feel? All people are recognizable in their voice. I don't want to take the time to quote it, but it's a given thing that people who know others well recognize their voices. I mean, it's hard to believe that Yitzchak doesn't know the difference between their voices. It could be, you never know. Maybe they just had similar voices. We definitely see that sometimes, particularly among siblings. Maybe that's the case. And if that's the case, it's so interesting to think about that maybe that was part of the divine plan from the outset for this moment. It's just an interesting thing to think about. Famous medrash, I'm sure many of you have heard of this. So when Yaakov, disguised as Esav, comes in and they speak, Yitzchak says, this sounds like Yaakov's voice. So what's the famous medrash on this? The word choice is Yaakov's word choice. Why in the world does the medrash say the word choice is Yaakov's word choice? Why doesn't it say what it sounds like? Oh, it sounds like Yaakov's voice. That's what you and I would have thought. So the Ramban says it must be that the medrash is assuming that wasn't going to be the distinction, because if it was the distinction, why in the world would Yaakov have not mentioned that at the beginning? So it must be that their voices were similar. So what does Yaakov, what does Yitzchak mean? It must be the word choice. Or maybe Yaakov had a unique skill that's not unheard of, but wasn't told to us in the Torah. Maybe Yaakov was good at making his voice sound like the voice of other people. And he wasn't worried about that. He knew he was good at that. He got his Esav impression down pat. Maybe that's the case. So we discussed this morning why Rivka hadn't shared the prophecy with Yitzchak. We discussed why Yitzchak wants Esav to go hunting. We discussed the significance of Rivka saying to Yaakov that Yitzchak said he's going to give a blessing before Hashem. And we discussed why Yaakov is not worried that Yitzchak will recognize his voice.